I'm going to zero in now on this letter's endnotes. Number 1 says the DTC data only includes securities that have FTDs of 10,000 or more. Number 2 says NYSE and NASDAQ use daily data from the CRSP. That's the Center for Research of Securities Pricing. It's a database used by academics to study historical security prices. And words. The main event here is this response sources DTCC and CRSP. Well, what's the dog that didn't bark? There's no mention here of information coming from broker-dealers. Thus, this does not include ex-clearing information. That is that system of IOUs that runs directly among brokers. Please stick a pin in that thought, and we'll come back to it later. In March 2005, the General Counsel of the DTCC, Larry Thompson, did an interview, but it was not what you or I might consider an interview. He talked with his in-house PR guy, for whom he presumably wrote the questions. Then Larry answered them, edited them, and published them on the DTC's own website. So he wasn't risking much. And there's little meat in the interview, but at one point, Thompson asked himself a question about the stock borrow program, and that is the DTC system for creating stock IOUs. Larry says, just how big is the failure to deliver, and how much of those fails does the stock borrow program address? That is, so how big is the problem, and how much is the DTCC able to address with their stock IOUs? Larry answers himself, and I will zero in on his first sentence. He says, fails to deliver and receive are 6 billion. That's including new and age, and that's out of 400 billion in trades, or about 1.5% of the volume. He's saying we do 400 billion trades a day, 6 billion fail to deliver. That's only 1.5%. That's not very much. Well, I wonder if 1.5% of the airplanes that took off didn't get where they were going, or if 1.5% of our nation's blood supply had HIV, would that also seem like a small 1.5%? Things got strange here. An economist named Dr. Robert Shapiro wrote a 6-page response to the CEO of the DTCC. I'm going to conduct some textual exegesis for a few slides. It's a bit dense, but I hope you stick with me because it's instructive. Shapiro starts by noting his background. He's a Harvard PhD economist, National Bureau of Economics Research, fellow of Brookings, Governor Clinton's economic advisor, Undersecretary of Commerce under Clinton, etc. So this guy isn't some lunatic who's putting tinfoil on in his hat. He's a heavyweight. Shapiro says certain comments by Mr. Thompson were inaccurate or misleading. I request you allow me to correct the record by publishing this response. Well, the DTCC didn't, so Shapiro went public with this. Now that's a little strange. We don't generally have undersecretaries of commerce using public letters to accuse officials of quasi-public institutions like the DTCC of lying. It's not the way business is done. So that should set off alarm bells. I'll take 2 paragraphs out of Shapiro's letter and walk through them carefully. Again, please bear with me. First, Shapiro notes that the $400 billion number is misleading because that's everything the DTCC processes, not just equities. Equities are stocks as opposed to bonds or other instruments, and the DTCC only does 82 billion of equities per day, not 400 billion. So Shapiro is saying, Larry, you said 6 billion stock fails is only 1.5% of the 400 billion you process, but you only really process 82 billion of stock trades in a day, and if 6 billion out of 82 billion fail, that's 7.3%. In addition, he says, the DTCC reports on his website that 96% of settlements are done through a continuous net settlement system. Well, what is the continuous net settlement system? It's a system among brokers that says if Goldman owes Morgan 100,000 shares of some stock and Morgan owes Goldman 96,000 shares of the same stock, we'll just net them and say Goldman owes Morgan 4,000 shares. Well, if that takes care of 96% of the 400 billion, then there's only 16 billion that really needs to be settled every day. And 6 billion out of 16 billion is 37% of the total amount of stock that actually has to be settled each day. So if 7.3% was high, 37% is ridiculous. Shapiro then criticizes Thompson for minimizing the problem by suggesting that it stems from paper certificates and human error and such. folks having trouble finding their shares, their dog ate their certificates, whatever. Shapiro notes that this can't account for the problem because, as the DTCC itself says, 97% of stock is electronic, not paper. Shapiro also refers to Bonnie's paper, pointing out that failures persist for 56 days on average, but sometimes months and years. Bonnie also argued not just that they persist, which they would not do if they were really just lost in somebody's desk drawer for a day, but that the failures are not spread smoothly like peanut butter across a slice of bread. They're concentrated in ways that can't be accounted for by random human error. They're pervasive, and if there were random human error, you could not account for the persistency, the concentration, or the volume. Thompson also says that the DTCC stock borrow program resolves 20% of the total problem. Well, I think that means that the stock borrow program does not resolve 80% of the problem. I'm not a Harvard economist, but I think my math's right on that. It means that in this system of 2.5 billion shares trading every day, that 20% of the fails are contained within the DTCC box as shown. What about the other 80%? It must be in the X-clearing system, that system outside the DTCC where broker-dealers settle directly with each other. The thing to know about that is the DTCC and SEC maintain that it is a private contractual matter among broker-dealers and not subject to SEC regulation or DTCC scrutiny. So this X-clearing system is more or less the Wild West, and that's where that 80% of the FTDs reside. So whatever the DTCC problem is, when one includes X-clearing, the whole problem may be 5 times greater. Greater than what? 1.5%, 7.3, 37%? And of course it can't be 5 times 37%, because that would mean there are more failures than there is stock needing delivery. And I don't think that can be the case, but at this point I'm not sure of much. The SEC FOIA response showed that at the end of every day there are 150 to 200 million FTDs outstanding. That's looking like 6 or 7% of every day's volume. But remember, at the end of the SEC letter, I've said, look at the sources from this, the DTCC. I noticed that there was nothing in there about X-clearing. Does the SEC or DTCC know what is going on in the X-clearing system? They're not saying, but it's not clear how they really could. What they're reporting is pretty scary, and by Shapiro's deconstruction of Thompson, it seems that they may be underreporting by a factor of 5. The right answer is the DTCC and SEC might be a bit more forthcoming, but getting information from them is like pulling teeth. The SEC is of late trying to be helpful, but the DTCC executives are refusing interviews and hiding under their desks. To go on from here, I must explain a term that's popped up a couple of times already, and that is short selling. I'll go back to grandma with her money and the guy on the right with the stock. I'll introduce a third player, a citizen who has stock in a company. Let's assume it's non-controversial, vanilla, perfectly legitimate company, and that it's trading at $40 a share. Let's say the guy on the right thinks his stock's going to go down. He wants to bet against the company. That means he wants to short it. What does that mean? Suppose he creates an IOU for a share of stock. He borrows the citizen's stock and replaces it with an IOU. Then he sells the stock to grandma and gets her money. Cool. The fellow on the right is hoping that the stock goes down, say to $30. At that point, he covers his short. That means he unwinds the short position by splitting his $40 into 30 and 10, goes into the market, buys the stock for 30. He sends that stock back to the citizen, wipes out his IOU, and he's left with a $10 profit. Imagine, however, that the stock goes up to 50. He wants to cover. He takes $10 from under his desk, combines it with the 40 that he's got. He's got 50. He goes into the market and buys the stock. Then gets the stock, sends it back to the citizen to wipe out his IOU. He's lost the $10 that he had to pony up from under his desk. So he's covered for a $10 loss. If this is new to you, think of short selling as like a mirror for your normal intuitions. Normally, if you own a stock, which is called being long a stock, when the stock goes up, you make money. and when the stock drops, you lose money. But if you're short a stock, then when the stock goes up, you lose money, and when the stock drops, you make money.